So finally, we want to see how these different actions of the Federal Reserve has an influence on the economy. So let's take a look at the expansionary policy things, right? So let's say, like this model shows, our economy is in a recession. So we see that our GDP is below its potential. Our unemployment rate is higher than normal, right? It's above that natural rate, and we're experiencing a recession. So what expansionary monetary policy actions could the Federal Reserve take? And really what we're saying by that is we're saying what actions would increase the money supply? Because again, increasing the money supply decreases interest rates, increases investment, increases GDP. And that's what we need right now. We need an increase in GDP. Well, what we would end up seeing is that the Federal Reserve could decrease the reserve ratio, they could decrease the discount rate, or they could buy government securities. All three of those things would increase our money supply, and therefore, as they increase our money supply and affect investment or consumer spending, it's going to shift our aggregate demand curve to the right. And as it shifts it to the right, again, hopefully we're moving ourselves back to a point where what we see is that all three of those curves, the short run aggregate supply, the aggregate demand, and the long run aggregate supply, are now intersecting, and we are currently operating at our potential. Remember, that's our goal. And it results in the fixing of that recessionary gap. We see our GDP is back to its potential. Unemployment rate has hopefully lowered back to its natural rate. And again, that's the goal of expansionary policy here. Decreasing the reserve ratio, decreasing the discount rate, or buying government securities, moving us out of a recession back to our potential. Well, how about on the other side of things? What if we need contractionary policy? What if we're experiencing rapid expansion and we need to pump the brakes? So we're above our potential. Prices are experiencing inflationary pressure. We've got this rapid expansion. What could the Federal Reserve step in and do? Well, again, they could just do the opposite of those other three things we had talked about. They could increase the reserve ratio, they could increase the discount rate, or they could sell government securities. And all three of these things would slow the rate of growth or shrink the money supply, which is going to have an impact on our GDP. And what hopefully that would do was bring our aggregate demand curve back to a point where it's intersecting with all three of these lines, our long run, our short run aggregate supplies, and our aggregate demand, all at the same point. And so again, that would result in us fixing that expansionary gap. It'll bring our unemployment rate back to its natural rate, and it'll stabilize our prices that were before experiencing inflationary pressures. So how exactly do we see this play out? Well, we actually see some really good examples of policy, not just monetary policy, but fiscal policy too, back with the Great Recession. So the Great Recession, again, I know we've talked about it a lot in passing. It took place from December of 2007 until June of 2009. We saw that our GDP had fallen by about 4.3%. Our unemployment rate hit 10% at its peak. And the government and the Federal Reserve were like, hey, we need to step in to do something. So what exactly did they do? Well, the Federal Reserve, what they ended up doing is they dropped the discount rate. So they decreased the discount rate from 4% to 1.75%. Remember, what that means is it became cheaper for banks to borrow money from the Fed. And because it became cheaper to borrow money from the Fed, banks were able to borrow more money and extend more loans. Loans were cheaper, and so there was more investment and more consumer spending, which helped stimulate our economy. The biggest thing that the Federal Reserve did is they bought trillions of dollars in those government securities. So they bought government securities. And what that helped to do was to pump more money into the money supply. We also saw that the government took some fiscal policy actions, primarily through what we call the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or the ARRA. What that included was billions of dollars in tax breaks and tax incentives. So again, that's the idea of decreasing taxes. That money, also what they did was they put billions of dollars toward education and infrastructure, over $800 billion in total by increasing government spending and decreasing taxes. And so we can see how these policies were working together. 4 of those 5 different specific actions that we talked about between the Fed and the government, 4 of those 5 were implemented during this time in order to help increase our GDP and get us out of this recession.